Gary DePaul with Unlabeled Leadership. Welcome to episode 48. Anthony Vaughan adapts by discovering context. Here's a shout out to listeners in the United States, in particular Alabama, Birmingham, and Fairhope. And by the way, I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Also, a shout out to listeners in Minnesota, in Andover, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Rochester. With that, let's get started. When I think of entrepreneurship, I think of Anthony Vaughan. He's founded multiple brands, companies, but his true passion really is in the area of HR, as you're going to discover from this podcast. Oh, and speaking of podcasts, Anthony is the host of the Project 2030 podcast, which started April of last year. This is, as he describes it, it's an informative exchange designed to empower, teach, educate, and inspire the next generation of people leaders. As I said earlier, his passion is in the HR area. He's been a chief HR officer, and he really knows a lot about compensation, performance management, leadership development, and what he's doing now, which is really interesting, is employee experience design and development. He also knows quite a bit about talent development, also as you'll discover on this podcast. Part 1, A Chameleon's Complex and Interconnected Network. In my book, What the Heck is Leadership and Why Should I Care?, I write at the end about Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis had a best friend, or as he says, the best of friends, whose name was Robert White. And what's unusual is Davis is black, White is white, but White was also at one time the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Maryland. Daryl Davis's story is amazing at how he was able to have conversations with not just Robert White, but other Klansmen. And if you get a chance, you should try to find his TEDx Naperville video, which I'll leave it in the show notes. I tell you all this to introduce you to Anthony Vaughan, who is going to talk about, an unusual upbringing. I'll just leave it at that. And somehow I see some similarities between Daryl Davis and Anthony. Here's Anthony to tell his story.
I grew up in a very interesting dynamic. From birth until about 7th or 8th grade, I grew up in this very, very affluent area. $1 million homes, very affluent friends, all different colors and backgrounds and races and dynamics. And so it was very interesting. Out of nowhere, I'll never forget it to this day. I was uprooted to Baltimore, Maryland. I'm not sure how much you know about Baltimore, but Baltimore, for the most part, is very different. And the area that I was moved to was very different than where I grew up. Homes were in the maybe 100,000, maybe 170, 200 if you're lucky. Kids were coming to school, not eating at home. We're getting their meals at, the only times they really ate throughout the day were the breakfast the school would give them and the lunch the school would give them and a snack on their way home. Friends were dealing with deaths in the family and all different types of things. And there were shootings and very different dynamic. So that's the context for me. And then I never forget what my mom said to me one day. She said, I raised you to be a chameleon. And I never understood what she really meant until years later. And now I finally do understand. What she meant by that is she put me in so many different dynamics and situations, whether it was the expensive camp she would take me to in the summers, or whether it was going up to North Philly, where she grew up, and taking me predominantly around African Americans and a lot of different cultures and races and quote unquote, the urban term of the hood, or taking me then back to the $1 million home areas and all the different extracurricular activities and sports that I would do. And then as we moved to Baltimore and all the different energies and the complexities and human beings I was interacting there, she said, I purposely designed your life for you to be a chameleon. She said, correct me if I'm wrong, AJ. And this was a couple of years ago. She said, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can go into a boardroom and talk to a man that's sitting across from you or a lady sitting across from you wearing a $75,000 Rolex that runs a $100 million company, or you can immediately flip over and then go to a nice tailgate with a couple of your buddies and put back a few beers and just kick it like you're one of the homies. You have this nuanced ability to be a chameleon, and I think that's going to be a really good thing for you long-term in life. She definitely was right. That's something that's really helped me in my business and my personal life and my friendships. And it's really helped me a lot with my leadership and being able to understand different employees and different partners and different energies and personalities.
What it tells me is that by being a chameleon, what that comes out into the business world or into your life is that you value everyone, regardless of their upbringing, their wealth, their opportunities, and can relate and identify with those people very well.
1,000%. It's seamless for me. It's not difficult to pull off at all. It's genuinely because it's locked in my subconscious now. And so a few years back, I did a lot of research into neuroscience and psychology and all these different elements. And again, I realized that what was happening over the years of my life is all these different situations and personalities and perspectives are just getting jammed into my subconscious and then would be getting locked into my memory banks. And so for me, I literally was pulling off of just my natural state of who I am when going into these different rooms and these different dynamics and these different situations. And so again, now that I'm going on being a 31-year-old full-fledged adult and man running a business and doing different deals and partnerships and hiring different folks and having different conversations, I find myself being a chameleon, not in an inauthentic way, but in a very authentic way, because it literally is who I am. What a lot of people don't realize is that whether you're an African-American, whether you're a Caucasian, whether you're any other type of race, there's actually a lot of people that are the complete opposite of being a chameleon. And this is where a lot of the DE&I conversations fall into place. A lot of people actually feel super comfortable talking to just folks and interacting and working with folks that look just like them or think just like them, or have had prior situations and experiences that were very similar to them. And for me, I think why I immediately kind of I don't want to say didn't resonate with the DE&I conversation, but it kind of threw me off a bit is because of the way my mom raised me, where I was such a chameleon. I never thought about it that way. I just thought everyone, frankly, had the ability to interact and communicate and work with all different shapes, colors, and sizes.
You were living that experience, definitely, that other people don't have.
Yeah, exactly.
The thing that strikes me is how critical it is and crucial it is in the business world, but from a slightly different perspective. While a lot of people get along, they feel comfortable being around like people. When you are around people, and I can imagine even you could be around someone who is opposed to who you are and your presence, you could still get along with that person. If you were extremely liberal and another person was extremely conservative, most people could not have a conversation. I can anticipate, and thinking of some people I know in my life where you can actually have conversations, and not only good conversations, but I can see that you would enjoy talking with people that are so different from you.
When I was the head of people for a company a few years back, we actually hired someone that had never literally, and I know this is so odd, that had never literally seen another color.
Oh, wow.
He grew up in a very, 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 very small town in Louisiana. He literally never saw another color. And it was very, very different for him kind of interacting in that setting. And he was a white guy, by the way. And long story short, so many other managers within the organization, frankly, found it very difficult because he was so qualified for the role and he was such a rock star. They were so excited to bring him in. Because you and I both know this, right? Interviews are nothing but more than PR moments.
Sure.
Everyone's PRing themselves, right? You don't really know who you're actually getting until you get them into the org. And what they didn't realize is that they felt, when I say they, the other managers felt very uncomfortable interacting, frankly, and understanding how to deal with or support or lead or communicate with this guy. And I had no problem with it. I thought it was super fascinating. I thought it was interesting. We had conversations about it. And he said to me, he's like, no disrespect here, but he's like, I've never met another Black guy, period. But he said, watching movies and TV and other things, I thought you guys would be a lot different than what you are. I didn't take that offensively. What I took that as is kind of going back to our conversation. I think since I'm such a chameleon naturally, I feel like I don't fit any prototype or any scenario. I feel like, again, I'm me / I can blend and navigate in different situations. And so to your point, I was not nervous or uncomfortable for 1 second when interacting with this guy.
Part 2, Executive Realignment. In podcast episode 41, Don Kirky and Ajay Pankagar talk about a leadership principle called encourage growth. In my books, I call it encourage change, but encourage growth is a little bit more descriptive. And you'll notice it when you hear some of the underlying beliefs related to it, such as helping others figure out their development enhances their ability to contribute, and also encouraging people to grow and leave their role contributes to organizational growth. It's with this particular belief that is relevant for the story that Anthony is about to share. And I'll let Anthony explain it. Here he is.
My former COO, Naya, dear friend, went to his wedding this past year via Zoom, by the way. That was an interesting one. He's a great friend. When I came into the organization, Naya was in a role that he was naturally very skilled at doing, aka the COO role. But one thing that I inevitably found out about Naya is he had a lot of different interests and passions that he wanted to flex and that he wanted to experience, and never quite felt he stumbled upon the right leader that would push him in that direction. When I came into the organization as the head of people, the way I structured my role is I was not only the head of people, but I also had, I don't like to say this, but it was pretty straight up within my contract and the way we created the role. Outside of the CEO, I had like executive authority and power in, like, I don't like to use those words. You've gotten to know me a little bit. I don't like to say that, but
Yeah,
the way it worked out, the other executives and managers reported directly to me. When it came to EQ, leadership, communication, team building, personality type dynamics of a role within an organization. Now, they were not my direct report when it came to like tiny tasks, being a COO or being a CMO or being a general manager of, or being, a head of whatever the case is. But when it came to more of the human side of the organization and the human side of being a leader, they reported directly to me and I held them accountable. What I realized when interacting with Naya is that he was about to leave the organization. And at the time, Naya accounted for a very, very, very substantial part of why we were successful. If Naya had left that organization, the organization would have been in a very difficult spot. There was no succession planning anywhere within the organization to replace Naya. Naya was such an ad hoc character and so great at his job, and we were moving so fast as a startup. There were no documentations around processes and workflows and best practices. There were no systems that were built that would kind of replicate what he was doing. It was all kind of on that one person's back.
so a major setback if he ended up leaving.
And you know enough about business, big hole. You never want that to be the case. But that was the case. That's the reality, right? So that's the context there. Now, what I realized is he was going to be leaving the organization because he had so many conversations with our CEO about changing his role. The CEO, as you probably can understand, did what behooved the brand, which is to keep Naya exactly where he was 100% of the time. Now, me coming into the organization, I conducted my first one-on-one with Naya. And in my very first one-on-one, I realized that Naya had a passion for poetry. He had actually published a few pieces of writing a few years ago. He had a passion for just writing in general. He had a passion for storytelling. He had a passion for like creating narratives. He enjoyed PR. He enjoyed creating partnerships. He had an experience previous to this role where he was actually the partnership director for a nonprofit. And he wanted to move his role into more of a PR, communications, partnership design type role. The COO role just was not super exciting for him any longer. And he was thinking about seriously leaving the organization to go and pursue that goal.
Where his passions are.
Where his passions were. And where his previous skill sets were. So it wasn't even like he was a wishful thinking man. He actually had wins and success and tactical skills in these departments as well. He probably could have gotten an opportunity somewhere. actually. And now that, if you really want to kind of think about it and get granular with it. And so what I did, kind of here's my leadership part of this, where I did is I presented this data to the CEO like I'm supposed to, made it very clear to him, we are going to lose Nia. It is a fact, it is objective. And me being the head of people, I'm a little bit different than your traditional HR person. I'm not going to do what behooves the brand. I'm also going to do what behooves the human. That's how I roll. You knew that bringing me in. And I have a suggestion of how we can create a win-win. Let's over time really figure out what Nia wants. Let's extract as much data as we can, and let's start to massage his role a bit. So right now he's a fully 100% COO. Let's taper it back to 85% COO. Let's start to create some mentorship programs on behalf of Nia to really see if his writing skills and his PR skills are where he thinks it is. I have a partnership background. I ran a partnership consultancy firm for 3.5 years. Let me start to work with him with some partnership design and looking into how we can create more partnerships on behalf of the brand, because we didn't have a partnerships director at the time. And let's figure out how me and Nia can start to, or Nia and I can start to collaborate on some of those projects. And over time, I created a 6-month program where every single month we would start to taper back 5%, 5%, 5% of his role. To replace the tapering back, I started having Nia document everything, create processes around his work. We found a really young fellow in the organization that genuinely always looked up to Nia in the shadows, and we brought him in to sit underneath of Nia and watch Nia, and we groomed him. And so over the 6 months, we were able to switch Nia to having 30% of a COO role, and where the other young fella replaced the other 70%, and the processes were put in place. And now the other percentage, he was doing some of the more exciting things. Unfortunately, due to COVID, the business was shut down, so we weren't able to see the full-fledged outcome of what this would have been. But here's the punchline. Nia never left the company. And the company was able to sustain the COO role, the operations of the organization. And frankly, we needed that sustainability. I think that's a good example of me reacting to someone's context, being empathetic, but also strategic to behoove the human and behoove the brand.
Definitely. And I love how you managed to keep Nia's intellectual capital within the company. The organization did documentations, brought someone in to, and how you progressively increase that other person's role in the COO role so that you can encourage the growth that Nia wanted, which is one of the leadership principles, is helping people grow and develop mentally and morally and just mature in those ways.
1,000%, 1,000%. And it was something, again, that I think what I just broke down is not a crazy radical thing. I mean, you Google it right now, it's a pretty standard best practice, but I think you would understand and you would agree, a lot of companies don't do it.
A lot of companies don't do it.
Right? It's something that is pretty common and standard, and I shouldn't be rewarded, but I think what I should be rewarded for is having the courage to create the synergies of what the human wanted, what the organization wanted, sustain the, the intellectual, properties and capital and knowledge that Nia had within the org, kept his retention, kept him there. Also thinking about how to, I just think there's a lot of moving pieces that happen that where I think leaders get lazy. I think what I did was very tiring, very thoughtful, very strategic. At a human level, exhausting, frankly. There were a lot of moments where it was not easy on the human side of it and on the communication side of it. And I think a lot of leaders get lazy because what's easier, Gary, and I'll end my rant here, what's easier is for a leader to do what behooves him or her, and then inevitably what behooves the brand.
This is a good example of someone who is not extrinsically motivated by money and even recognition. His intrinsic incentives, his outlet that he really wants, you manage to tap into. But you're so right. If it's not within your quote unquote standard procedures, a lot of people don't want to do it. They don't want to make that extra effort of adapting to be able to come up with a better solution.
Yep. And so that's why I think if I'm good at anything, it's examples of it's like that. I'm very weak in certain areas when it comes to this world, but I'm very strong in examples like that. Because examples like that, I feel, show off what leaders should do. It shows off the thoughtful energy of how to protect and sustain a business model. It shows off how to be super humanistic and empathetic at a very strategic and operational way. I think what happens a lot, Gary, is a lot of folks do part of it. So there's a lot of HR managers or a lot of heads of people or a lot of culture leaders that just have the general conversation with Naya, and they just build that relationship and they say, Naya, that's so amazing. Let's have a conversation about where you want to be and what you want to do and things of that nature. And they really want to help Naya. They actually believe in it so much. But here's what happens. Your typical HR leader, when they go to their CEO or the COO, whoever they report to, they will paint a picture of what Naya wants. And then inevitably, due to the pressures of the conversation and frankly, the way that their role is designed, that's the big caveat, Gary. If you remember in the beginning, the way my role was designed is this was my call. Obviously, the CEO could have vetoed everything, but thank God that we had a really great relationship. I didn't have to look anywhere else to make this call. I kind of already had the full green light on this. And that's frankly how I think more of the head of people or the chief people officer role should be designed. But I think what happens at the leadership level is when they go to their direct reports with this energy or with this idea, the pressure of that conversation immediately turns them from a human to a robot. And then I believe they start to go back into their subconscious, which is, what did business school teach me? What does my CEO want? What is going to behoove me and keep me from staying out of the hot water? Because I know this is going to be a difficult thing to sell.
You made it a win-win situation. I think this is where what you described, the chameleon, comes into play, because you understood what the CEO needed and how detrimental it would be if Naya ended up leaving the company. And you also understood Naya was going to leave the company. You managed to marry the two and come up with a solution that kept the company going, that really developed a lot of loyalty with Naya and motivation to ensure that he's able to make his successor successful. At the same time, make the company successful by doing the documentation of and the processes of his role.
Yep. And again, I don't blame a lot of folks for not doing certain things like that, because there's a lot of red tape inside of roles, and maybe that's another day in another conversation for another day. But I was thankful to have that flexibility and that confidence to do that. So,
Part 3, it's about context. There's a lot of stuff written about adaptability, about discovering opportunities, and even resilience. Anthony has developed some expertise around adapting. Here's Anthony to share some advice with us just on this particular topic.
When I started the E1B2 Collective, which is my company, I genuinely thought about calling the company Context, even though I thought that was a horrible name, so I never did it. But that really sums up everything that I'm about. You know my background. I'm not really an expert in anything, I don't think. I think what I'm great at is reacting and unpacking and living into and loving someone's personal context and their personal story and what makes them them, and figuring out what they want and trying to connect it to the brand. And so if I can give any leader any advice, it's figure out context, AKA figure out context in a, diversity of thinking and learning perspective. When you're putting in learning and development tools and procedures and best practices, think about context when it comes to auditing the retention issues you may be having and really figuring out why you're having those retention issues, and diving into the context of the employee and going to the employee first and letting them drive and navigate the best practices and structures and processes that you need to put in place. Don't look at what Google or Coinbase or Airbnb are doing to solve retention issues. Look at what your people actually say they want, AKA their context, and then use that data to then make your decisions on what you need to do. Think about context when it comes to career mapping and career ladders. Think about context when it comes to creating compensation bands as a leader. Think about context like you do when you think about your branding and your marketing and your product decisions. Organizations think about context all the time when you're rolling out product, when you're thinking about marketing initiatives and branding initiatives and Facebook ads and commercials and writing it from a PR perspective, but we tend to not think about context when it comes to leading humans. Human beings are the most complex things floating around this world. We have so many variables of our brain and who we are there's just so much data to unpack. And so as leaders, we need to continually try to find ways to unpack that data, unpack that context. So context in big uppercase letters.
If you tap into context, you enable adaptability to make sound decisions.
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. That's the best way to put it.
My thanks to Anthony Vaughan. If you'd like to learn more about Anthony, go to the show notes. If you have a comment or question, go to unlabelledarship.com, click the message icon, and you can leave a voicemail message for up to a minute. Thanks to those who contribute to the show. Your contributions help with the production cost. And mostly, thank you for listening. Until next time, lead on.